Okay, thank you. I am going to talk about children and the architecture of children's hospitals. It ties into what several people are talking about today, which is the interplay between designers and users. In particular, I'm interested in my own experiences with the theme that children can articulate their own architectural experiences, and that can feed into hospital design. So the story goes something like this. A few years ago, I was walking in downtown Toronto, and I decided to stop in at the Hospital for Sick Children and take a few snapshots of their giant 8-story entrance atrium. I had actually just been hired by Anne-Marie Adams, who's a professor of architectural history at McGill University, to work on a project on hospital architecture. Now, Anne-Marie's research is kind of a usually ingenious combination of the history of medicine and the history of architecture. But in this case, she had a really simple, straightforward question. She wanted to know why the up-to-date, state-of-the-art hospital looked so much like a shopping mall. So this is the pair of slides she used to illustrate her question. On the right is the West Edmonton Mall, still one of the largest shopping malls in the world. And on the left is one of the atriums at the nearby Walter C. Mackenzie Health Sciences Center. They're both in Edmonton. They both opened about 30 years ago. So why should the hospital, which is a place for science, for health, for healing, be organized architecturally in ways that are so similar to a place that's all about shopping, about fast food consumption, about entertainment, about diversion? Well, we had the beginnings of a hunch. We had been studying the history of children's hospitals. Children's hospitals are weird for a number of reasons. One is there aren't that many of them. So if you think about it, almost every city has a hospital. Some of them have dozens of them, but there are only about 15 children's hospitals in Canada. It depends how you count. So they're a very special kind of place. And one of the things that's special about them is that they're arranged according to ways that adults, that is society at large, thinks children should like them to be. That is, about our views about childhood and sick children. So we speculated that perhaps this way that hospitals use bright colors and whimsy and fast food, the kind of fantasy decor you see in these examples, that's the Valley Children's Hospital in California on the left and the Alberta Children's Hospital on the right, that they might have been first accepted in children's hospitals. Another way that children's hospitals are very weird is that they're one of the most important places, or a key important place in society for philanthropy. So on the left is a still from a TV show. And in the TV show, they use the stories of children's suffering in the hospital as a way to encourage television audiences for charitable giving. This function of hospitals, children's hospitals in particular, is very, very strong. It's true of all hospitals, but for some reason, our views about childhood lead us to invest in children's hospitals as a charitable place, whether giving money or volunteering our time. And hospital architecture has to account for that. The image on the right is from just around the First World War, and this one is a plea specifically for money for a building. Note that the building is in a kind of pastoral setting. And this is yet another peculiar thing about children's hospitals, is the deep connection between the idea that a sick child needs to be next to nature. So here's another more recent example. This is, again, see how the building, the architect has drawn it as if it's in the middle of a garden. This is the Evelina Children's Hospital in London. In fact, it's in downtown London. It's just across the River Thames from the Houses of Parliament. And the architect could have shown that historic location or the dynamic urban location, but instead chose to connect the hospital for sick kids with shrubbery, trees, grass, plants. All right, so this is the hospital I was going to visit, Hospital for Sick Children, or Sick Kids as it's known. On the left is an image of the old section, so-called old section. It opened just after World War II. You can see it has sort of rows of vertical windows and a crisp brick facade, very undecorated. Characteristically, we call these hospitals factory-like or institutional. On the right is the new section, which was a 1993 addition to the old part, designed by Zeidler Architects. And the giant 8-story atrium I wanted to visit is just behind the giant glass wall you can see there. Unfortunately, when I went in the front doors and pulled out my camera, the security came right away to say, put that camera away. So I didn't get my snapshots. But, there's always a but, that day I was going to meet with Patricia McKeever, who's a health sociologist at the University of Toronto. Now, many people here know Pat. I hope you'll agree with me. She's the kind of person who likes to help people, and she's really good at getting stuff done. That's a pretty powerful combination. In this case, she couldn't help me at all right away, but we ended up with a much more ambitious and rich and interesting research project about architecture in the atrium. So the project that I'm mostly discussing was worked on as a collaboration between Pat in Toronto and Anne-Marie here in Montreal. The main idea was we wanted to compare architectural intentions with children's experiences. This has many unusual features. For instance, most health researchers couldn't care less what architects want. That is, when they're researching what a hospital is like, they're interested in things like efficiency or better functional organization or lower costs or something like that. We weren't interested in that at all. We really wanted to know why the architects thought that the environment that they were proposing was appropriate for children. All right? So this is the environment that they proposed. You can see the large expanses of glass that I talked about, lots of exposed structure, the giant beam painted white. Many of the staircases are exposed, the elevators are exposed, those yellow things on the right. And there's a ton of kid-friendly art. So the important one is the one on the left. It's a sculpture called Barnyard Flyers by artist Jane Buckles, and it features a very large fiberglass pig dressed in a tutu who moves back and forth across the atrium above your heads on a tightrope, which is actually a device concocted by the architects from a downhill ski lift. So the part of the hospital we're concentrating on are highlighted in gray in these two slides. On the bottom is a roof plan of the hospital. At the left is the old section. On the right is the atrium tower. And above is a section cut vertically through the atrium. You can see underneath is the underground parking, and surrounding the atrium, there are 5 floors of inpatient rooms. So besides not really worrying about how the hospital was organized, we weren't really worrying about whether it was good architecture or not. So for instance, we were surprised when we looked at these drawings to realize that the volume of the atrium was a perfect cube. So perfect cubes and perfect geometry in general are really important in architecture. Think of the Egyptian pyramids or things like that. But what the question was is why did they think it was appropriate for a children's hospital to have an atrium that was shaped as a perfect cube? It turns out they couldn't care less. They didn't even realize that it was a perfect cube until we told them. So our own criticisms, our own interpretation, our own presumptions weren't in play here at all. Getting the architect's intentions is fairly straightforward. You can ask them, and there was a ton of archival material, journals and so on, where we could see what they actually said at the time. But understanding children's views on architecture was a little trickier. You could just ask them, but they aren't really known for their, let's say, sophistication in talking about architecture. And we weren't even really sure what they would respond if we asked them about architecture. So we had this idea that we would give them a camera as well, and they would go around the atrium and take pictures of the architectural features from various spots. But we were also really interested in this idea of what kids had to say. So Pat came up with this great idea of making a partnership with the Children's Council at the hospital. The Children's Council is an elected 10-member advisory and advocacy board. They're nominated by hospital staff. They meet about once a month. And just, they're not usually involved in the research, but they happily participated with us. I'd like to point out two other members of our team member in this picture of the council. On the left, it's Ellie Goldberg, and on the right, Cora McLaren. The council was fantastic. They wrote letters on our behalf to granting agencies when we were looking for money. They helped set up the interview questions. They helped us to recruit children for the study. They even went with Pat to present some of the preliminary findings at academic conferences. We needed some semi-specialized high-tech tools to do the research. We needed a digital camera that even 4-year-olds could operate. We had a kind of unobtrusive digital recorder. We engaged a graphic designer to make a logo and some team identity. And on the bottom right, a portable printer that turned out to be fairly important too. Kids nicknamed it the toaster. What happened at the end of their interview, they were encouraged to kind of print out a couple of their photos. And that really, for some of them, made the whole process more enjoyable. So here are some of their photos. We had 80 kids involved altogether, children and youth, 50 from outpatient clinics and 30 inpatients. They took photos of everything. They compared the building to all sorts of kinds of architecture, churches, hotel lobbies, shopping malls, of course, even the Roman Colosseum in one instance. Lots of them took pictures of the art. This isn't art, but Miss Piggy, for example, I think 2/3 of them took a picture of her. They talked a lot about their photos. Part of the interview process was talking about the photos that they'd taken, as well as following them around through the atrium. And the issues were, well, some of them you'd expect: safety, security, family, things like that. Yeah, and many of them took whatever pictures of nature that they could find. This was a 4-year-old who was a little desperate to find some flowers in the building. But what's, I guess, sort of most satisfactory about the whole thing in the end was how the kids were able to zero in on the sort of most complex and most interesting architectural issues, the issues that counted most for the architects. So for instance, at sick kids, they take newborns, so essentially age 0, right up to the age 18. So they have to design the architects for very small children and adolescents. And there's an incredible amount of discussion. How do you balance something that's sort of kid-friendly and something that's sort of age-appropriate without veering completely into Disneyland? And the 13-year-old boy who took this photo on the right thought that they had failed miserably. So the image on the left was far too busy for him. There's too much going on, too much noise, too many colors, too kid-like. And he took this photo to show instead how it should be more symmetrical, calm, composed. That's what a children's hospital should look like. So overall then, the project persuaded me that kids had actually quite sophisticated and self-reflective architectural views. For me, many of these photos are quite thoughtful. They show kids are able to come to terms to express what it's like to be a sick kid in the hospital. That is, the loneliness, the solitude, the kind of anxiety, maybe a bit of faint optimism as well. One 13-year-old girl told us in her interview, and I just want to make sure I get her quote right. She said, "We may be children, but we do know things, and we know how to speak." So I hope you can see why I believe we should learn how to listen. Thanks.